Greetings, I am Eben Bloxham. Here's a new series about the novel. I often think, what is a novel? When I'm choosing what to read next, I think, why should I read this? What's the point? Why am I reading one of these? Haven't I already read this? There's multiple different facets to the novel, and the way the novel is approached has been changed over the years. I mean, there's plenty to say in this series. This video, however, is going to be more of an introduction to the ideas, the kind of things I'm going to be talking about. I don't really want to focus on reviews. Goodreads is the best place to go for reviews. I just want to talk about the idea of it, as in the kind of things that I think about when I'm choosing what to read. Right. So, in this video, I want to talk about what is genre fiction, and what is literary fiction. Again, I don't want to talk about tropes quite yet. A good channel where they talk about genre tropes is Terrible Writing Advice. Quite funny. Recommend you look it up. It talks mostly about fantasy tropes, but it talks about other tropes as well. The dreaded love triangle, for example. That's sort of a running joke there. People sometimes think too much about tropes, and they only see the trope and they don't see the original part of the story. So if I have a guy in a medieval village fighting a dragon, that's a trope, but maybe that's a really interesting story about a guy in a medieval village fighting a dragon. So you sometimes miss the wood through the trees, as it were. What is literary fiction? Some people don't like the term literary fiction, partly because it sounds pompous. This book is more important than that book. It is literary fiction. An author might be arrogant about their book, maybe not. However, if you look at it from a publisher's perspective, what is literary fiction makes much more sense. So from a publisher, so let's focus on the publisher's perspective. What is commercial fiction? What is art fiction? All fiction is commercial. Art fiction is commercial from a publisher's perspective. When a publisher publishes a kind of book, they expect a certain amount of money back from that particular kind of book. If I write a recipe book, if I publish a recipe book, I expect a certain amount of money back from a recipe book, obviously if I've done it properly. A tour guide, and the thing works in fiction as well. So literary fiction, I would have a certain expectation of how much money I would expect literary fiction to make if I was a publisher. Genre fiction follows predictable patterns in order to guarantee success. When I commission you to write me a romance novel, I probably want it to go A, B, C, D in a predictable manner. I want it to follow the rules. And also, indeed, that provides predictable results. So if you write me a romance novel and you make it all weird and, interesting, it's going to be unpredictable. If you write me something in a certain manner, I can guess how much it's going to make. So depending on the kind of publisher I am, maybe I just want steady money. However, it's not completely impossible for genre fiction to be innovative, to be interesting. Ultimately, even if you are following certain tropes, following certain rules, if it's exactly the same as everything else, it's going to get forgotten very quickly. Frankly, if I was a publisher, I'd be more interested in write me a romance novel, but write me a romance novel that sells well. Sometimes things happen randomly, surprise. Sometimes marketing promotes a book far more than you would expect it to. But ultimately, people, when they pick up a book, they don't want to repeat precisely the same experience again. Maybe they do want to repeat the experience again. And that's the reader's prerogative. If you want to get the same feeling you had from reading one book and another, then why not publish a trope-filled book? Right, the rules. The rules of genre. I did some ghostwriting for romance fiction, and then I read about ghostwriting romance fiction, and the person in the article was appalled at how strict the rules are for romance. In a romance novel, you have a three-act structure. Certain surprises happen at certain points in the three-act structure, and they were appalled that you could possibly organize your fiction in a predictable fashion. Romance fiction must be completely redundant. Are the rules of romance stronger than the rules for other genres? Maybe. One of the reasons why romance is focused on so much by publishers is because romance outsells other genre types by orders of magnitude. So if I'm a publisher and I want to just make money, I'm definitely going to want to make romance novels. But there are, of course, rules for other genres. Like I said, terrible writing advice is pretty good at analysing fantasy tropes. Not to dwell too much on precisely what the tropes are. However, there is one thing I noticed about fantasy fiction. Why is it always pseudo-medieval? Why can't we have something pseudo-Renaissance or pseudo before that? I mean, if you have a world of magic, then you can literally do anything at all. It's magical. There is no limit. And yet, it's always in the same, it's put in what's probably roughly an England type place, in the what is roughly about 1200 AD. You don't go forward, you don't go back. Why is it always then? There are some fantasy stories that go beyond that, of course. But that's what I'm saying. Genre fiction always finds ways to break the rules. There are certain authors. If an author's just repeating the same old crap, then nobody's going to buy it. So there are plenty of exceptions to my rules. There are plenty of exceptions to my stuff I was talking about, romance. I'll repeat my point about wanting to relax into the familiar. One of the reasons people read genre fiction is to relax. Particularly if you've had a hard day at work, you want to sit back. I don't want to have an intellectual exercise. I just want to relax and have fun. Maybe I want to try to repeat the experience. If I read the same book, I'm going to get bored though. So even if I try to repeat the same, I'll say romance fiction again. There's an interesting part in The Sandman. I'm sure you've heard of The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. It's a series of comic books. One of the stories has a woman who works in a diner. She works long hours. She works pretty much every day. When she gets home from work, tired, she imagines the people in the diner and tells a romance story about them. She wants the world to have a happy ending. So she gives everybody there, if a person comes into the diner and they look exhausted and they look miserable, she wants to write them a happy ending. So she takes the idea of the person home and writes romance stories about it. It's kind of sad, kind of cute, and then obviously she gets horribly murdered after that. So, that's nice, isn't it? So why did I tell this story? Well, the woman in that diner is the sort of archetypal romance reader. I just want to relax into the familiar. I'll probably do a video about romance fiction in order to point out that it isn't entirely artistically redundant. The trick with a romance novel, I think, is the most important thing in a romance novel is the characters, not the plot. If the plot is predictable, the lovers get together at the end. It's the journey and it's the characters. But that's for another video. Right. Rules of romance fiction, rules of fantasy fiction. Space opera might have rules, particularly military science fiction. These are things I know more about. Of course, there are lots of other genres. What other genre can I think of? Sports fiction. That's a genre. I've read a couple of those. Not quite the same as sport itself, but there's one exception to that rule, but that would be a different video. Gangster fiction. I'm not sure if that's really a movie thing rather than the book thing. This stuff I'm talking about is a crossover because it's about storytelling and movie producers want to make money. So much of this is transferable to movies. So it's certainly gangster movies. But what is literary fiction? So we've done genre fiction is predictable. There are rules, but if you want your book to be remembered, you have to find a way to break the rules without upsetting the feeling of familiarity. Literary fiction, in the past, perhaps, literary fiction was seen as proper fiction. If I was a 19th century critic, I might say that Charles Dickens and Mary Shelley wrote very thoughtful human stories about thoughtful things, and therefore only smart people read them. And if you read an adventure story like Sherlock Holmes, or if you read some kind of adventure story about pirates or something, that's just messing about, and that's a waste of time. And you're not a smart, proper person. That's not really the case with literary fiction. Maybe it was the case in the past. Certainly not now. Get to that in a moment. But if genre fiction has rules, my definition of literary fiction is stories without rules. Therefore, because there are fewer rules, it's from a publisher's perspective, it's less predictable as a selling product. So literary fiction isn't so much intellectual, the proper thing to do. It's just everything else. If it's not romance, sci-fi, not fantasy, it's everything else. It's literary fiction. Of course, literary fiction can often crossovers with genre fiction. The most obvious example is romance. If I looked at Thomas Hardy, a very serious English author who wrote serious fiction. He didn't really. It's much more relaxed than that, but maybe I'm sounding like an English literature teacher. Imagine the English literature teacher telling you to read Thomas Hardy and not to read Mills and Boon. Romance is an important element in Thomas Hardy books. I mean, arguably, many of the books are indeed romances. He's most famous for the melodramas. Test of the D'Urbervilles, Jude the Obscure. But there's a romance. Test of the D'Urbervilles is arguably a romance, just with an unhappy ending. Certainly, and that fits into, literary fiction. Characters fall in love with each other. That's what happens in real life. It's kind of one of the reasons why I'm quite interested in romance fiction. So hang on a minute, dragons doesn't really happen. Spaceships doesn't happen to normal people. People fall in love. So there's quite a lot of crossover, and indeed you can read a book of literary fiction in the same way you read a genre novel. You don't have to read Thomas Hardy and think about the themes, and you don't have to analyze the characters and analyze the structure and da-da-da-da. You can just go, oh, like Dave from the village and Mary from the village, and they fall in love, but like the families don't like each other. So you can read Thomas Hardy, you can read literary fiction in the same way you read genre fiction. So romance is common in literary fiction. Ghost stories are common in literary fiction as well. I mean, that's classic sort of horror stuff. I'm quite sure why ghost stories are popular. Maybe it's the excuse. Maybe Charles Dickens wrote quite a lot of ghost stories. Maybe it was he wrote his big long serious novels, and then he wanted to write something fun and fantastical. He wanted to write a fantasy, and because J.R.R. Tolkien hadn't written Lord of the Rings yet, his fantasy was ghosts. So literary fiction can have a serious theme. It can be philosophical. It doesn't necessarily have to be. If my definition of literary fiction is everything else, maybe it doesn't really work on an intellectual level. I mean, you can have bad literary fiction. I've read a couple of books, and I couldn't tell whether they were historical fiction or literary fiction, and it's probably supposed to be quite deep, and it was about the Second World War and, horrible things, but it was so meh, and I was like, I can't take these ideas seriously. I'm supposed to be concerned about the Holocaust and stuff, but this book is just not the book if you want to learn about that. So literary fiction might cover genre, but it won't give you the feels. If I like The Woman in the Diner, I read a romance novel in order to repeat the experience, to repeat the feeling. I'm not going to get the feels from a literary novel, even if it has romance in it. Genre novels might attempt to shock you. Maybe two lovers are crossing the street and a car drives down the road, slams into the man, kills him instantly. The romance is destroyed. If this basically doesn't happen for any reason at all, that's probably just an excuse to make you cry. Arguably that's a poor plotting. You're just throwing this in to shock me. You might have the same thing where you're fighting the dragon in the village. You're about to kill the dragon. You're about to slit his throat, and then the person fighting accidentally slips on a stone, bangs his head, doesn't wake up. Dragon still burns the village to the ground. Accident. Shock, horror. Again, probably that's not the best thing to do if you're trying to tell a dragon story, but there's a point about throwing in things for the sake of shock. Killing off characters. There are interesting ways to kill off characters, and then now you're just doing it in order to make people go ooh. So literary novels make you think. Genre novels are there purely for entertainment. It's not really as simple as that, particularly not in the modern world. Particularly, of course, because genre novels can make you think as well. My classic example of that is science fiction. Science fiction is often deeply philosophical. The classic sci-fi is, imagine sort of 2001 telling you about the origins of humanity. Or I can imagine a possible future. What does it mean? What does a certain technology mean? If I make robots, what does that mean for humankind, for the human future? iRobot being a classic example. Offshoots of that, Battlestar Galactica, the machines take over. AI is a real thing. If I tell you a story about an AI that takes over the world, that's a reflection of the real world, even if the world I've built is in the future and AI is a robot that does weird things. So I don't want to dwell too much on specifics. I just gave that example because that's a simple, easy example, but there's plenty of ways to argue about how fantasy is thoughtful, and indeed romance as well. Right, the mix between high art and low art. So if high art is an old sort of 19th century thing, perhaps Charles Dickens and his ghost stories. I write my serious books and I write my ghost stories. These are just fun. Now these ideas mix. I can tell a thoughtful ghost story. I can tell a story about like poor people in London, and the point of it is just like a crime story. The little kid is stealing stuff from rich people. That's my story. It's a crime story, not a thoughtful story. So concepts mix as well. So I can read, like I said, I can read a serious novel as a genre novel. I can read a genre novel as a serious novel. Concepts mix. One interesting feature of this is you can read genre fiction and you can learn about the time it was written. The values of the time that it was written are often a feature of the book. If I want to learn about what people thought like in the 1960s, I'll read some 1960s genre fiction. I'll read the difference between science fiction in the 1960s and the science fiction in the 1990s, in the noughties, whatever. That will reflect. I can get a historical lesson from my genre fiction, for one thing. But also just types mix. Literary authors know, now modern literary authors know that you can mix genres. Know that when you tell a story, you're often reflecting some type of genre. Like I said, romance is often a feature of Thomas Hardy. You can actually take a genre trope and put it into a literary work. It's definitely a literary work because it doesn't follow the rules, and if you read it, you're going to be disappointed if you want the feels. A good example of this is Cloud Atlas. Cloud Atlas mixes 4 or 5 different genre types, puts them onto one book. Not necessarily the greatest book ever written. It's just a good example of. It's also not the greatest work ever written. It's just a good example of how you can slam different genre types together creatively. And of course, there are lots of other books that do this. But let's talk about Cloud Atlas for a minute. You have space opera sci-fi with spaceships and stuff in it and robots. You have sort of murder mystery type thing with a composer. You have what's the other one? There's middle section. This is actually the part of the book I don't like. The middle section. It's supposed to be. It's sort of. It's a kind of science fiction. What's it called? Predictive science fiction, where you're guessing what happens in the future. Post-apocalyptic. Humanity's collapsed. The reason I don't especially like it is because the prose is written in the way that they might talk, which didn't work in the 19th century. I don't think it works now because I can't read it. I don't understand what they're saying. So it was just an effort to read this book. When the movie did it, the movie showed me what was happening. I didn't have to wade through this difficult prose. So the movie, my preference is the movie over the book in that case, which is unusual because I didn't have to read that. So that middle section really ruins the whole experience for me. I'm also not convinced by the composer portion of the book, partly because the composer portion of the book is a repetition of a story I already knew, a real life story I already knew. However, I'm not talking about reviews. I'm just talking about the ways that you can combine genre fiction. You can slam together. Oh yes, there's a kidnap plot in Cloud Atlas as well. There's a kidnap, so there's like a twee little English village kidnap plot thing going on. But that one works. I mean, these he's literally mashed together different genres into one book. Extraordinary. Other books do this to more or less extent. Might do it in a more subtle way. But it's possible. So it's possible now. What I'm saying is it's possible now to have genre fiction and call it literary fiction. Also, because of the way people understand things, like I said, you can learn something if you read some, naff 60s crime story and some naff 90s crime story. You can learn something about the time it's written. So therefore, it's worthwhile to analyze everything, even trashy genre fictions. You can analyze Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, the first modern novel. Perhaps that's a video for another time. And you can analyze Spider-Man as well, and you can learn different things about it. If you want another book that mashes together popular tropes with thoughtful tropes, literary tropes. There aren't any literary tropes. There's no rules. Thoughtfulness. Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. She happens to be my favourite author, but in this particular book, there was a genre fiction in the 19th century where the end of each act of the book, they would introduce a big shock, and each time the big shock would be bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is the classic shock for the sake of shock thing. Sarah Waters takes this idea, tells a story about people in the 19th century who tell stories, and their lives get these sudden, sort of slightly ridiculous plot twists at the end of each act. So she's, in an intellectual way, but also just an interesting story anyway, mashes together genre tropes and thoughtfulness. In all of this intellectual stuff, you probably still have to tell a half-decent story. Although, in fact, there is still a market. Again, we'll end with the publisher's perspective, where we began again. There's a market for experimental fiction. I know how well Will Self is going to sell. Who's publishing Will Self? He's quite famous. He writes weird books. I'll make the books that take effort to read, which is fine. There's no problem with that. Not good or bad. Just it is, for the sake of this video. So there's the market for experimental fiction. It can exist. There's no reason to stop writing it. The world is a big place. You can have it all. You can, in fact, have your cake and eat it. Probably don't want to eat your book. Okay, that's episode 1 of What is a Novel? Please comment below suggestions on this topic, or indeed suggestions across the channel would be welcome. I've been Eben Bloxham. I'll continue to be Eben Bloxham forever and ever. Amen. Please like and subscribe.